to Nurse Talk, where we go beyond the headlines and we talk about everything that's shaking healthcare and spotlighting people caught in the middle. I'm your host, Alice Benjamin, aka Nurse Alice, and in this episode, we will be confronting three different stories that are hitting headlines. Now, they are painful, polarizing, and again, painful, really. I mean, not only for patients, but for nurses and for healthcare in general, which is why we are here to talk about it. We want everyone to know better so we can all do better. So, today's story is just to give you a highlight at the top of the show, everything that we will be talking about. First, we have a wonderful story here. Well, I don't know that I can't say that's wonderful. Sorry, I shouldn't have said it that way. But Adriana Smith, this is a 26-year-old ICU nurse who has suffered a traumatic brain injury. She was declared brain dead. But because she was pregnant, her body is being kept alive under the Georgia state's heartbeat law. And this is against her family's wishes. Then another story we'll be talking about is Camille Meyer. She is a nurse who says she's been bullied, isolated by a group of coworkers who she refers to as the Filipino mafia. Now, while her feelings of exclusion are very real, the phrases she used in combination with a recent TV portrayal has ignited controversy and has caused real harm, not only to her, but also to the nursing community. Words do matter. And then finally, we're going to wrap up with a story about Jamie Simpson. Now, this is a young woman with epilepsy who says she's had multiple seizures in an ER waiting room. And she asked for her husband to stay with her, and he was there for a moment, and they were begging staff to help her. She was having seizures, but according to her stories that went viral on TikTok, she was ignored until it was too late. Now, these are three very different people, three very different settings, but all challenged by one healthcare system. And to help me unpack this tonight, I have a wonderful host of panelists who are going to help us to identify what should happen next. So please welcome to the show. We have Alicia Truelove. She is a registered nurse, patient advocate, and your autoimmune ally. We have Dr. Dana Vidal, nurse executive and nurse career coach. Dr. James Q. Simmons, hospitalist and nurse practitioner. And Tracy Holder, registered nurse and nurse burnout coach. Okay, welcome panel. Thank you for joining us tonight.
Thanks for having us, Alice.
Now, okay, we got lots to talk about here. And I will say the first story, something that was very horrific when I heard it, Adriana Smith. This is, again, a 26-year-old ICU nurse. Dare I say, one of our own, because everyone on this panel, we're nurses, right? Also newly pregnant when she suffered this very devastating brain injuries and doctors declared her brain dead. But it's because of Georgia's heartbeat law. It prohibits ending her pregnancy because there was a fetal heartbeat detected. Now she's being kept alive on life support against her family's wishes. Now her loved one says that this is what she wouldn't have wanted this. Her colleagues are feeling conflicted, and this actually has become a national story. There's debate all over the place as to who gets to decide what happens to a woman's body, especially when she's no longer able to speak for herself. And in this moment, obviously, she cannot speak for herself. But I have a clip here for those who are not familiar with this story, and we actually get to hear from her mother and a little bit more about this storyline. So I'm going to pull this up, and everyone take a watch here.
They didn't do any tests. She was gasping for air in her sleep, gargling. More than likely it was blood. They did a CT scan and she had blood clots all in her head.
Doctors declared Adriana brain dead. 30-year-old Adriana Smith was about 9 weeks pregnant because of Georgia's heartbeat bill, which bans abortions after a fetal heartbeat is detected. Her family says they weren't given any say in what happens next.
And I see my daughter breathing by the ventilator, but she's not there. And I'm touching her. And she has a son who I bring to see her.
Now, 21 weeks pregnant, her baby's health uncertain.
She's pregnant with my grandson, but my grandson may be blind, may not be able to walk, wheelchair bound. We don't know. if he'll live once she has him. It should have been left up to the family.
Adriana has been on a ventilator for the past 90 days. It's likely doctors will not induce Adriana for at least another month. And it's not just the baby's health the family is worried about, also a medical bill. They say that continues to grow every day.
I'm not saying that we would have chose to terminate her pregnancy. What I'm saying is we should have had a choice. We should have had a choice.
Yes, indeed. And choices do matter. Now, this is a very heartbreaking story. Lots to unpack here. So I'm going to turn to my panelists. Dr. James Simmons, first off, your reactions.
I mean, she said it right there at the end. It's all about choice. And the fact that they didn't have a choice, it's obviously a much larger picture than what the individual providers in that hospital could offer to that family, what that hospital is allowed to do, because frankly, the states and the laws have gotten in the way of this. And they are antiquated laws. They are laws that are not based on the evidence. They are laws that are not based on human dignity and human rights. And I think a lot of people feel this way, whether or not they, and I'm going to be a little controversial here, but whether or not they agree with abortion as a principle or as a medical right, in this particular scenario, we have completely removed the ability for the family to legally and rightfully make a decision on behalf of their family member. And I think that's really the key. She really nailed it there at the end when she said, it's not that we would have terminated my own daughter or my daughter's pregnancy, but we weren't given a choice. And I think that's really the issue here.
Okay, you raised some really good points. Now, Dr. Day, hospital executive, someone with years of leadership experience, looking through that lens, what goes on behind the scenes in cases like this? I mean, what are administrators balancing? What kind of pressures are they under? One from the staff, another from the family, and then also from legislative bodies to uphold the law yet still take care of patients.
Great question, Alice. I think that one of the biggest challenges is, and this happens across the country to nurses consistently. I myself have been in that situation where I've had to take care of a patient who threatened to come in there and cause harm, patient family member to cause harm to some of the nurses because they really didn't want certain nurses taking care of their loved one. Early in my career, I had to take care of a patient who had been accused of being a pedophile. Nurses face these situations every day where they are facing potential burnout, the things that come with emotional exhaustion, and it's a moral crisis for many of them. Right now, hospital administrators would be trying to rally around that staff. They'll be trying to rally around and trying to prevent some of that burnout and handle some of those issues. They may be calling in chaplaincy, they may be calling in grief counselors, social workers to come in and be able to help and assist the staff who still have to take care of this patient, whether they agree with the politics behind it or not. And it happens very often, unfortunately, but this is what happens when patients become a pawn in the middle of policy and politics.
Now, if I can just ask just one other question about that. So great explanation about what goes on with the staff. How about patients? When hospital executives have patients, their families, their loved ones, relatives from all over calling, demanding, a different plan of care for a loved one like Adriana, what then happens behind closed doors that people may not know about? Like, what are those type of conversations look like?
Many times at the very highest level, executives are meeting directly with these patients and directly with the family members of these patients, trying to mitigate risk, trying to make sure that they are within whatever scope within public policy that they can legally be able to meet the needs of that family. I can almost guarantee you in this situation, the hospital system is trying to do their best, but their hands are somewhat tied when there are politics that are involved that legally they cannot be able to do really what ethically that they know is right.
Thank you for that. Now, very devastating and challenging place to be. You're really between a rock and a hard spot here. Now, Tracy, let's talk to me a little bit about how the nurses at the bedside may be impacted with this. How do they emotionally cope with continuing care when they may personally disagree with what's going on, especially as something as devastating as this. And if I understand correctly, Adriana is at the hospital in which she worked. So these are her colleagues, these are her friends, these may even be her classmates, people that knew her both inside at work as well as personal. So what do you think the nurses are going through, and how can they emotionally cope with this?
Yeah, this is a good, important, critical piece that when we have to take care of our own, one of the things that comes up, like Dr. Vidal mentioned, is moral distress. And for the audience to understand, moral distress is when a nurse has a feeling, an ethical idea of what is the right action to be taken, but the hospital or legal system or institutional situation prevents that right choice from being happen in that using the moral compass. Also, they're taking care of someone who is brain dead. This is body that's being kept alive solely for the purposes of gestation. And this contradicts goals of end of life care, which is comfort and allow for a peaceful death, to allow dignity. The other main thing that came up is, for me, thinking about this, is the person's own autonomy. This person does not have autonomy anymore. And another huge piece of this for all the staff members involved, including the family, is the grief. Now, this is a person who has died in the medical eyes, but whose death is not being acknowledged, is not being processed in a normal way. That can complicate the movement through grief and the resolution of grief.
Now, thank you for that. Alicia, you too, just as Tracy mentioned, has spoken out a lot about bodily autonomy and patients' right in the advocacy work that you do. And as well, you've shared your stories about kind of silent illnesses and not feeling heard by healthcare providers. What strikes you the most about Adriana's story?
It's a devastating story. And I think that when you don't have a choice in the way you're able to live your life or receive treatment, it's very problematic. It opens the door for a discussion to be had around advance directives or a living will. Would an advance directive have helped in this situation? I mean, I'm not a legal expert, but I would assume that if there was something in writing that was written, that was here, that was put by Adriana, that have still been followed? I think it's an important conversation for all of us to have as we navigate these new changes in healthcare, to be sure that we advocate for ourselves, that we have these conversations and we think about what our own wishes would be.
You made a good point. Having an advance directive, a law versus a legal binding document of how I choose the care I choose when for myself when I can no longer advocate for myself. That's a very good point. We'll have to consult with a medical attorney on that, because that actually I'm a little dumbfounded about what would happen in that situation. Now let me turn to the entire panel here, because this is a story that is morally distressing. Everyone's watching this because we want to know what's next, what's going to happen, because although this is a young woman who is pregnant, what if this were a different medical scenario? I don't know, something along the lines of cancer or hospice or whatever the case may be, but still a medical situation and my wishes aren't being honored. What do we do in situations like that? Like, what can we do? What kind of support can we offer for Adriana and her family? And then also stories like this that are probably yet to come.
I mean, I feel like the support for her family is number one, right? Like that's clearly the thing that those on the ground and those who are intimately involved, as well as an entire nursing community, because she is one of us. That's what we really need to focus on. On top of that, I do think that those of us with sort of platform and privilege and the opportunity to speak out about these things should have conversations like Alicia, what you just brought up. I'm not sure that a lot of 25-year-olds think about, I mean, as nurses, we probably do, but I'm not sure that a lot of people think about an advance directive, think about goals of care in the way that we as nurses with this experience do, but the public needs to know that, right? And so even we have a situation here of a nurse who is in a situation she probably could have never imagined, right, in a million years. But even going into any type of healthcare environment, even if it's something that feels as routine as childbirth or as routine as like a checkup, and hers obviously went completely sideways, but having those conversations about like, what exactly do you want done with your body in that environment? Alicia, I think you bring up a really great point, and we don't even think about that in younger people. That's a conversation that we really, especially as nurses, we are well positioned to have with a lot of people, even if it's over wine at dinner on a Saturday night. Be like, make sure you got your paperwork together and your partner knows what you want, because you don't want to end up like anyone, not necessarily Adriana's situation, but you don't want to end up like anyone where your family has to make a decision or isn't even given the option, but your legal paperwork could have changed that.
You know, you raise a good point. And as someone who is a family nurse practitioner, this is actually raising my own eyebrows that whenever someone comes in for the annual wellness exam, I know it's a checklist. On the checklist, there are things to address, and sometimes it gets overlooked, especially if someone's otherwise young and healthy. But I believe that this is an opportunity to become more assertive in that area to make sure our patients and the public get this just as much as you'd get a breast exam, you'd get a prostate exam, you'd get your blood pressure checked, making sure that we're truly indeed having these conversations, and like sliding that paper in front of you, or that now we use computers, right? Getting that document in front of you to say, hey, this is important. Let's talk about this now, because this is going to be more difficult to talk about when the time comes. Everyone's going to be looking for this document to help guide us. Because when someone's gone, oftentimes the family's left struggling or arguing amongst each other about what to do. And now we bring in the law, we bring in, so many other things into this conversation, and the family has completely no control of the situation. So very, very sad story. So
I agree. I was also going to say, from the hospital perspective, it's really key to have a strong ethics group there. Having within your shared governance, having an ethics committee or council, or one of those councils that does manage those things, because this is one situation, but these things happen consistently. Being an ICU nurse, you see all the time patients maybe on a ventilator or being kept alive, when as the clinician involved, you really have really good clue that all of the indications from the vital signs and the clinical status, this patient may still be suffering, but there's really nothing much left to do. And we're just keeping them alive through innovation and science and medicines that can do those things. But I think it's really important in the hospital setting. I would advocate for every hospital, to have a nurse ethicist that is involved directly, that 24/7, that there's a way for the nursing staff to be able to reach out and contact someone, particularly in these high stakes ethical situations.
Good point. And that actually should be a consult on every case, probably for everyone who comes in the hospital, whether things look bright and discharges in 5 days, just to be aware of what's going on and what their resources are for these very important conversations. Good point, Dr. Day. Now let's move on to another story that's quickly gone viral, but requires some nuance here. Okay, there is a nurse by the name of Camille Myers. I hope I said her name right. And there are videos circulating the internet. Now, while I've not seen the video myself of her speaking, there have been tons of reactionary videos and other things floating out there discussing her particular story. And she recently filed a lawsuit here in Los Angeles. And in the lawsuit, she describes that she felt isolated and unsupported in her unit. She's claiming that she was targeted by a group of Filipino nurses who she referred to as the Filipino Mafia. And also that phrase and in those videos are spreading, very, very quickly. Now, while those posts resonate with many nurses who felt left out or unwelcomed at work, further insight reveals that in this particular story, that she was dismissed from her employer for administrative reasons, not workplace bullying. There is allegedly something to do with falsifying time clock situations. We're not sure, and that's not necessarily the important part of the story that we're discussing here. What we're here to discuss is, workplace bullying. So while Camille's feelings of exclusion are very real and they should not be dismissed, we do know that incivility does exist in nursing. We've heard of nursing eating their young. Feelings of feeling unwelcome on a unit. This has happened to me, and it happens too far often. But, and here's the but, right? but labeling that as a Filipino mafia or claiming that Filipino nurses are responsible for the bullying, I'm going to go ahead and say is unfair and harmful, and it uses a broad brush. It's painting with a broad stroke brush. Am I saying that correctly here? And that could be very harmful. And so, and then also add on to this that there are also there's a really hot fictional medical drama called The Pit that recently aired an episode using the same phrase, portraying groups of Filipino nurses as intimidating and exclusionary. So what happens when you have pop culture and personal stories? When those two things collide, does it reinforce stereotypes, and does it amplify division in ways that are difficult to walk back from? So while today's question is not just, what happened in this particular case, more important, how do we hold space for someone's pain without painting an entire community with it? So I'd like to show a clip here for those who might be new to that term, who've not heard the word Filipino Mafia. There is another clip from another show. It's called St. Denis Medical, and I'd like for you all to check this out.
Renee and Charisse will be in Zone A with
Nurse Matt, he'd be good. No, that was me. But I'd love to do Zone A. Also, I've never worked with Renee or Charisse.
me neither, but they tend to work with Tal and Dolores.
Oh, yeah, they are together a lot.
Because of the Filipino Mafia.
What?
The Filipino Mafia?
That's something that they call themselves. We don't just call them that.
Hospitals can feel like high school. There's cliques and hierarchy and the mean girls. And I'd say Renee is definitely the Regina George. But the Mafia's really good, so you just don't mess with them.
Uy, Ate Val, takwatsa tayo mamaya, ha?
Hey! I'm not Filipino. He just assumed, and it's kind of nice.
I never realized you put them together because they're Filipino.
No, that's not. No.
Oh, are they not Filipino?
Yeah, no, they are. Just please stop saying that word.
Wait, is it a slur? I've just been going around saying.
Just stop, okay? The four of them work together. That's just the way that it's always been.
Got it. You know, my grandpa used to say that's the way it's always been. It's my cue to stay hush. Otherwise, I'm doing a hard time in the seed closet.
Okay, I need you to go to 114 with Dakota and Brandon.
114 with the other whites.
Not with the other whites.
Yeah.
I mean,
know.
that show is really funny, but I mean, a humorous way to attack it, I guess.
Well, I think that also, and we've seen comedians. There's always an element of truth in some of that comedy. It's a way to maybe provide some comic relief to a topic that may be difficult to discuss. And there are some truths to it. But and full disclosure, let me say this: I am actually half Filipino, half Black. So I want to put that full disclosure. So I feel like I have had the experience of both worlds, right? I've heard this term Filipino Mafia used before. When I've heard it, it's been used as a term of endearment. So very different from the way that it is being used now by people who are not of the Filipino community. So it really creates for interesting dynamics. But Dr. Day, I want to go ahead and start with you again, our hospital executive. So, and let us know also, are you familiar with this terminology? And, when you hear stories like this, how should things like this be handled? I mean, we have a nurse who, let me, I guess, paint a little bit of history. Came on as, I believe, as a new grad, excited to be a nurse, as anyone would, at what she thought was her dream place, found herself on a unit, and it wasn't a good fit for her, and then she was let go. Again, she believes it was because of bullying and other things, but on the other side of it, there were some administrative and possibly some performance issues. From your perspective, when you hear stories like this, how should they be handled in hospital systems?
Well, first of all, to answer your first part of your question, I was not familiar with this phrase at all. Not in my practice. I'm a girl from Atlanta, Georgia. I'm from the South, and there's plenty of diversity, but that particular group is not necessarily one of those that that's been in a lot of the hospitals I've worked in. But it's still no different from some of the things that are faced by other groups that are maybe marginalized or maybe what historically has been called a minority. But I will say something, and I don't know if this might be a little controversial, but I will say that any hospital that has these type of what we would call problems, right? These issues, I still want to give kudos, because what it says is that they do not have a homogeneous nursing population, right? Their patient care community is being reflected in the patient in the staff that they've hired. So kudos to those hospitals who do have to face this issue and put protocols in place and practices and build a culture to welcome them. Because the first step is to have that patient care staff reflect the community that it's serving, right? It needs to be diverse, not a melting pot, but it's more of a potpourri, right? We're not all supposed to blend in and be homogenized. We are all individuals we bring different cultures, and we have different traditions and norms. And that is reflected in many hospitals. But the next step is to make sure that that culture is there, that is accepting of that and is welcoming and does not add to some of the stresses that nurses must face every day. And in these situations, leadership does have to respond promptly, right? It creates psychological safety. We depend on each other in these hospital settings. And the last thing that we need is to have issues amongst the patient care team. Healthcare is complex enough as it is, just on its surface, without these other underlying issues. So it's important that leadership is building an infrastructure that supports the diversity that they are trying to achieve with their hiring selections.
Absolutely. And, Alicia, you, again, our advocate here, you're always, you're a champion for patient advocacy, nurse advocacy, and also a proponent of storytelling. How can we validate someone's experience, whether from leadership or bedside, while still challenging the language that has a potential to stigmatize a particular group?
I think what Dr. Vidal said about diversity, hiring diversity, I really like that take, because it does reflect our patient populations, and we do have better outcomes when our care providers are reflective of that. But with that being said, also, like she mentioned, is these experiences that all of us have in healthcare, whether we are patients or whether we are nurses, we all need to collectively realize that our experiences are personal to us. Our experiences are something that are very meaningful to us, and all it really takes is someone to listen, rather than to explain like, oh, we have to. Well, here, let me back it up real quick, because again, what Dr. Vidal was saying with creating these healthy and safe environments is really the key. And I know she mentioned leadership, but there's also that element that our direct frontline nurses need to understand also, is you are leaders, therefore your experiences are important, and we need to equip them to be able to handle these issues at the bedside in a way that is non-punitive, in a way where people are able to express their emotions, their experiences, their stories, without that fear of retaliation. So I do very much support what Dr. Vidal was saying.
Okay, and I think that's important. And for those who are listening, because again, for some people, the term Filipino mafia may be something that's new. And again, full transparency, I'm half Filipino. So let me just say, I came to know that word as a form of endearment. And just a quick little history lesson, but I believe it's like 1960s or 70s or so. Listen, this nursing shortage has been going on for years, decades, if you will. And there was a point where the United States government was actually seeking help from countries outside of the US for help to fulfill our nursing shortage. And the Philippines was willing to be of assistance in that. And in fact, they increased the numbers of their nursing schools, and they actually increased the number of their nursing graduates by 700%. So they could have nurses in the Philippines, and some of those nurses would come here to the United States. And I actually have Filipino cousins who've come over under those types of circumstances. So so in certain regions, you may see more Filipino nurses than others. I know Dr. Day, I don't know, Dr. Day, it might be Atlanta. It might be that heat why they don't want to, that humidity while they're avoiding it, because they come to California, but I say that to say that, there's lots of rich heritage that we should not forget in this story. So, Filipino nurses are here because we in the United States needed their help. So there's a lot of them here. Now, moving forward, and I'm not a part of I don't know any of the nurses directly in this case, but being in this for over 25 years, I can imagine that someone, if I was a new grad on a unit, I'm already I could be very sensitive to feedback and what's going on. I want to do my best. Every new grad has felt that wherever that you've gone. And so we also know that nurses have eaten their young. We know, and we're not proud of it. We know it exists. And then there's also an element of possible cultural barrier in the way that we communicate. And if I could best translate this as to, like, ER nurses communicate very differently from med-surg nurses. And we just know these things exist. We don't necessarily approve of them, but we know that these idiosyncrasies and these nuances exist. So what happened in this situation, we don't know. Could it be a combination of new grad, cultural barriers, shortage of staff, like all of these things could maybe create the perfect disaster for someone who is so excited to be a nurse and it's their first job there. But we also know, Dr. Day, you have a book coming out, Find Your Fit. It's not out yet, but sometimes we end up on units that just aren't necessarily our fit. But I'm just only adding that to the background. Her feelings and what she reports are very real. I don't want to dismiss or diminish that. But for this conversation, I think it's really important that we take a bird's eye view of all of the things that could be happening that may have contributed to any type of miscommunication or exacerbation or inflammation to why she felt how she felt, or why things may have happened. I don't know, but I just wanted to add that 2 cents for people who are maybe newer to the story, newer to the terms, or just learning about the story. But let me pivot to you, Tracy, because incivility, it's a real issue in nursing.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, go ahead, Tracy, because I was just going to ask, are there better terms or tools that we could be using to talk about these issues without defaulting to labels? Like, Filipino mafia. If again, for me, it was a term of endearment, but now I feel like it's being used in a derogatory or negative way. And I would just hate, there are great nurses out there, great Filipino nurses out there. And I would just hate for everyone to be labeled unnecessarily because of one case.
Yeah, and that's the difficult part about this is just the part about the soft skills about being a human being. I mean, it's in the title of a human. We are human beings, not human doings. But in this effort of trying to understand our place in the world, there's somewhere in our minds where there's a lot of unconscious biases happening, right? And sometimes perhaps we would probably group certain peoples together in a way of trying to, in my own mind, try to deal with, like, okay, these are similar types of people of this group, so this is how I'm going to deal with these types of people. So not only is this seen in cultures, but let's talk about it as in patients. How often have we heard patients referred to as their medical condition and not their name? Or we refer to them as frequent flyers, or we say ER nurses are this, and you see the memes on Facebook and Instagram of this is a ER nurse, all messy, and then this is the ICU nurse, all the wires are all tight and labeled. So I think these are just unconscious biases. So the more that these issues come up, it's so good in a way to have conflict, because conflict shows us that there might be some gaps in our understanding of me, who I am, my place and my relationship to the world, and what the world means to me. So I would like to know, having these conflicts, what does a hospital have in place? Is it obvious for a person, like if I'm getting bullied or I'm feeling like I'm being victimized, is it advertised well in the hospital what number I need to call? What confidential sources can I go to find help to talk about my feelings? Because as we said earlier, words hurt and they create feelings. And these feelings come out because of behaviors that someone did. So that's the important thing to focus on, is how I'm feeling from the behavior I just experience. And if leadership has ways to every so often offer training on what bullying looks like, that way it might be more obvious to people.
Wonderful. You made some really good points there. Now, Dr. James, I'm going to pivot to you, and I'm going to speak for the, let me talk for the people in the back here. There are people who are going to say, leadership knows and they don't do anything. You're going to have people that say that, or it gets swept under the rug, or it never bubbles up to a point of action. And I'm just saying that because I know there are people who are watching this who are thinking those exact same things. So, Dr. James, how do we prepare nurses for navigating these diverse team dynamics without resorting to those stereotypes, especially in times where they may not be seeing that swift action or swift results from leadership to intervene?
Yeah, I mean, you bring up a point that has been going on in nursing since Florence, probably since forever in nursing, that there are, not only are we a diverse group of individuals, but also we do have this culture of as you put it earlier, we eat our young a little bit. That said, the stresses that we as nurses are put under, what we have to deal with on a daily basis, and the terrible healthcare system within we have to operate leads us to look for care and solace in any ways that we can get it. And a lot of times when you are a historically marginalized community, particularly if you are an immigrant historically marginalized community, you are going to find comfort in familiarity. This is why we as human beings, particularly in stressful environments, tend to group together, whether we should or not. So I think this is why this is not for me, different from Dr. Vidal. I've heard the Filipino mafia from day one of nursing school. It's just been a part of the lexicon in every single place that I've worked, and I've been at this game for 15 years now. So that said, I think it is really important to understand that from a systemic standpoint, and it can't just be institutions, but from a systemic standpoint, we have to look at our profession and say we are incredibly diverse. We represent our patient population. There are, depending on who you ask, 4 or 5 million of us, and that there are certain, just like anywhere in the world, in any profession, there are certain norms and standards that we have to hold ourselves to. So I'm really curious, not being Filipino, how the Filipino community, particularly at that hospital, reacted to this. I think that's really important. I also think that there's really important opportunity for discussion around this to say, hey, you can actually say that there is a specific group of people who you felt bullied by, fair, legitimate. We cannot use these colloquialisms, right? You can't say things like Filipino mafia, particularly on TikTok or whatever, and put it out there and think that people are not going to react. Both truths can exist simultaneously. And I think it's really, Tracy said this before, this is just sort of like kind of like a wake-up call. Okay, we've got an opportunity to talk about this. Bullying still continues to exist. And we got to do better with our words. We got to do better with how we educate ourselves as a nursing community, starting from day one in nursing school, all the way through all of our continuing education with people who've had 50-year careers in the same hospital. So I don't, this isn't, the end of the world, of course, but I do think it is an opportunity, particularly in one of the 3 best hospitals on the planet, apparently in Cedars-Sinai. There's still some education that we've got to do.
Yes. So thanks for bringing those to our attention, James. You actually raised some good points. And I guess kind of to round out this story, I think we all agree that incivility is a problem in overall in nursing. It's important that we call out those specific behaviors for what it is versus using the wrong name for it or inadvertently labeling a group of people possibly incorrectly or unnecessarily, because that can turn it into something else, something that could be actually very harmful for everyone involved. So good discussion, team. So, okay, so our final story that we're going to round out here on Nurse Talk Live is we're going to be telling a story about someone who's not a nurse, but who actually is telling her experience from nurses. And so it comes from TikTok, and I know it's TikTok, but the consequences were very real because we have firsthand video capture of it from the patient themselves. And her name is Jamie Simpson, a young woman with epilepsy. She came to the ER with an infection, which was triggering her seizures. Now, she said she had multiple seizures in the waiting room. And while her husband was trying to get help, the staff pretty much shooed him away, asked him to leave. And so she was left to her own being in the waiting room. Now, a physician asked a nurse to watch the patient. Now, that's pretty challenging. I've worked in the ER. There's a waiting area, and then you're in the back. So how you can watch a patient who's in the waiting area, I don't know, but nevertheless, those were the instructions. And so per Jamie, when the nurse was asked to watch her, she seemed annoyed and dismissed her, and again, refused to let her husband sit nearby, and then was nowhere to be found. Jamie said no one else knew that she had epilepsy or what was going on, and she ended up having uncontrollable seizures. And listen, this is captured on videos. It was viewed by millions on TikTok, and I'm actually going to share that video here with you all as well. So let me tee this up, and my guests can let me know that they see it as well.
Is Sarah in there? All right. Sorry, she's not my patient. All right, everyone grab a leg.
Now, I don't know. You see stuff on TikTok if you wonder if it's staged or not. And this is a moment where I do not believe this is staged. I do believe this is real. And it's actually, it hit me really sad. You can see in the video there, someone saying, sorry, she's not my patient. When really, when you're at work, everyone's your patient. And it sounded like in the video, Sarah, who was her nurse, was in trauma 7. So for Sarah to have an assignment that's in trauma 7, those traumas are very involved. And then to have a patient that she's supposed to be watching in the waiting room did not set her up for success. But, we're going to focus on the patient experience because we're nurses all here on this panel here. There may be people who are also healthcare professionals watching, but we have a fair amount who are patients, who are on the patient's perspective. And what matters is the patient and what we're doing for them. And I don't think that patients often understand what's going on in the background. What's most important is the care that they received. And so we're going to unpack a lot about what's going on. But from a patient's perspective, Alicia, you're someone who has championed your story about autoimmune and chronic illnesses, and you advocate for patients like Jamie. What does her story tell you about how we treat people with an invisible illness, right? Because you can't look at someone and know that they have a history of epilepsy unless they're actually having one.
Yeah, for me, that video was pretty difficult to watch. I've been in similar situations as that. And it kind of, what Tracy said earlier about our biases, it's really important for us as healthcare providers to navigate our own bias. Like you said, an invisible illness might not present in a way that we can see. But there are things there that, at the end of the day, the patient is not feeling well. They're going to the ED for a reason, and it's in their best interest and ours to just make sure that we check our biases and say, okay, here's our patient, and try as best as we can to navigate these situations. I will say that in a similar example, I was being discharged from the ED, and I realized, well, not that I realized at that point, but nurses take a lot of the brunt of decisions that are made in these care settings. So for example, a patient came back to visit their loved one that was in a certain bed, and the nurse had to stop the visitor and say, we have a trauma right now. We're not allowed to have visitors back here when we have a trauma patient. And of course, that visitor was upset, and the nurse had to take the brunt of that anger and frustration of this person not being able to see their loved one because of a decision that may or may not have been made with their input. So I think it's really important that, as nurses who are providing direct care to patients, that they are included in these decision-making, with that example being a light.
Right. Now, in watching this video, we see the patient. You can kind of see her eyes fluttering. Now, it wasn't complete grand mal where she's like flailing around, but very subtle signs that she's having a seizure. And sometimes, I've seen people who kind of flicker their eye or even sleep with their eyes open, or at least it looks like it a little bit, right? So, Dr. James, speaking in your best assessment of the nurses that were around, would you say that this is a failure of knowledge, a failure of compassion, or a failure of communication? I mean, how could we have prevented something like this from happening?
I think this is a failure of not knowing everything. I think there's a lot to this story. While understanding that I want to make this explicitly clear, we all are not in this profession. We're not all having this conversation right now. We're not all doing what we're doing because we do anything less than completely advocate for patients at all times. So I want to make that explicitly clear before I say anything else, because what I'm about to say might be a little controversial to some folks. I think it is incredibly hard. We all understand someone having a heart attack. I'm going to even make it a medical analogy. So if someone comes in and says, my jaw hurts, and all of a sudden we're like, oh my gosh, this person's having a heart attack. We have to rush them to the cath lab. Let's go to the cath lab. And then we go in there and they need 7 stents. They're having an MI, right? When what we don't actually know is that person's jaw hurts because they just got punched in the jaw. And it has nothing to do with a heart attack. I think it is really dangerous for an entire community. I'm glad we're having this conversation, but I think it's really dangerous for an entire community of people to make judgments and assessments based off of one video. We don't know that her history. We don't know the conversations that were happening. Sarah might have just won the Daisy Award the day before. She might be the best damn nurse in the entire hospital. That hospital might be so overwhelmed and overworked. They might have put Sarah in 3 trauma bays. She might have had the hallway, 4 rooms, and 3 trauma bays, because outside of California, baby, a lot of people don't have ratios. So I think there's just so much about this that we don't know. And I think it doesn't do our patients, who are the most important, any service by piling on to either Sarah or this woman who posted the video. Clearly, she needed to get something out, and she needed to communicate that something went wrong in that ER. Seems like it went wrong in that ER. I would really hesitate to have anyone start pointing fingers at anyone other than our system, which find me an emergency room in the United States of America where something like this doesn't happen every day. And I think that's the bigger issue. We always, Alicia nailed this, we take the brunt of everything. Notice no one called out a physician. No one called out a CNA. No one called out a respiratory tech. No one called out registration. No one called out anybody else in that. No one called out the EMTs. No one called out probably the 400 people that walked past her, including her husband, who could have just refused to go to a different room. You know what I'm saying? My wife has absence seizures. He could have said that. Oh, okay.
I agree 100%. And I'm so glad that you said that. I do think that at the end of the day, being a nurse, we're always going to be thinking about the patient first. But I agree. I kept thinking to myself, we don't have all of the story. And the fact that now we don't know why. Why was the husband and not with her? Because that would have been another set of eyes that could have been watching. But we don't know. And I think it is a little dangerous. And the video is shows that one side. And it's unfortunate. And it does happen every single day. But in that ED setting, staff are trained to triage, right? And so the stable patient with a history of epilepsy may not get the priority because we don't know what else is going on. And just like you mentioned, Dr. James, Sarah was in trauma 7, right? So whatever was going on in trauma 7 in that moment, that was probably the triage priority of care. I do believe that one of the ways for these invisible things, these things that can escalate in a moment of time, that there are protocols that are put in place. So if someone does come in, if there is a seizure protocol or for someone who has a history of epilepsy, that we can't just let this person sit there by themselves, that there's something else that can be done. It doesn't matter if it's a unit, if it's the secretary and the ED to come over there and sit, you keep eyes on her in case something happens. But somewhere, somehow, like you said, the other 400 people, the ED has a ton of people. It is the most crowded patient care space in any hospital. There's any number of people who could just keeping eyes out. If there's some one resource staff who all they do is round in a busy ED to see if there's a change in status, because the way someone came in just a very short period of time could be a whole different, what we call an ESI level. That severity level can change in a snap of a fingers. And so for hospitals to do what they need to do to protect those patients, maybe protocols that are put in place for these particular type of situations. But yes, we don't know the whole story, and it is tragic. And I'm sure it was very frightening for this patient, what was happening to her. And she was trying to get that attention. But the way that the ED is set up, because of the resources that we are lacking within the healthcare system, it looked to me like in many cases, a lot of times these nurses staff, they're trying to do the best they can. And they responded very quickly once they noticed somebody was watching her, because she came over there saying that patient's name and noticed that there was a change in her status, and they responded immediately. This is not the type of outcome that we would want. We don't want patients in the waiting room having their an escalation in their acuity. However, it does happen. Things should be put in place from the system perspective.
Yeah, I think where it gets a little tricky is where we talk about neglect. You know, as nurses, we have some legal duties and responsibilities, and we live in a litigious society, of course. Sometimes as nurses, we need to stand up for ourselves. I had a physician once tell me, hey, stop that 5150 who was running towards me. And I'm thinking, with my body? Stop this grown man? No, I'm not going to put myself in physical harm. So in this way, could that person, Sarah, say, hey, doctor, I cannot watch that patient and these hallway people and give break relief and answer the phone and enter orders. This is where maybe some systemic changes needs to be looked at. But I want to go back to neglect, because to understand neglect, it's the failure to provide a patient with care, supervision, or services to maintain their health and safety. It's a failure of duty of care. So in this story, the neglect was leaving her alone. She's in a hospital. Anyone who's in a hospital, I guess some employees, they're going to be unstable. So anyone at any time can code. So, and then that failure to communicate, like Nurse Alice mentioned, was this a failure to communicate? Yes, there was several points where there should have been more communication. Like, I'm going to go to trauma 7. This person here is going to watch you for a while, and let that person know this person's in the waiting room. So yeah, I think a proper handoff and proper advocacy for the nurse and for the patient would have gone a little bit better if they were able to feel comfortable in doing that. It's so important.
Now I want to just you brought up some great points, Tracy, but I just want to interrupt. And like Dr. Day, like you said, obviously hospitals are stretched thin with staffing, time, and resources. We know that conditions can change. But to Tracy's point, now, again, we don't know the full story, but I thought I heard a verbal order there to watch the patient, right? So there was a verbal order. The physician asked the nurse to watch the patient. So a lawyer will have a field day and say, you had an order is an order, right? Even if it's a verbal order. So what happened? So while indeed Sarah was trying to be the best nurse that she can, she was responding. She was doing the best that her two little legs and her two little arms could do, in that moment. And that required her services in trauma Bay 7. So in those moments, obviously communication handoff is important, but if I'm running to trauma 7 because someone's bleeding out, I may not have it might not come out of my mouth right away. Like, can someone watch Jamie in the waiting room area? So I also wonder, where the charge nurse or where the resource nurse was, if they had one. Because also, let me be clear, working in the emergency room, it's unlike other areas of the hospital. While yes, us in California, we have a ratio. Our ratio in ER is supposed to be 1 to 4. If it changes to ICU, it's 1 to 2, right? Supposed to be. But we get stretched to the limits at all times. And when there are no beds to bring someone back, they have to sit in the waiting area because there's just nowhere to put them. But
a physician
in Georgia, we don't have ratios. And in
Right.
Georgia, I cannot even picture the hospital that I have experienced with as a level 1 trauma hospital. If there's a trauma coming in 7, I've got a fairly stable patient with a history of epilepsy. I'm not sure if I even know what's going on with that patient. The husband may have just said, I'm just running over here real quick and I'm coming right back.
He was shooed away. He was told to leave. The husband wanted to stay. He was actually told to leave because he was being a nuisance because he kept asking the nurses to come check on his wife. So there's another added failure.
Also,
how was he doing that though? So we don't know that whole story, Nurse Alice. How was he doing that? Was he being aggressive? We don't know any of that part of the story.
And
so
what
I just say,
position-
without knowing everything, it's very difficult to try and say what should have happened, what shouldn't have happened. Having seen these things on a daily basis, the ED is a very tricky place. And if I'm running and you say, oh, well, I'm gonna, it sounds nice to say, I gotta run to trauma 7 for this patient who's bleeding out. Let me go find someone who can come watch this very stable patient in the waiting room. It sounds really nice, but I believe, again, having protocols in place, that's why the example that Dr. James gave of the heart attack, the jaw hurt, there's a lot of training around that because it is strokes, MIs. There's very, very strict and rigid and very well communicated protocols about the procedure that happens when a patient comes in with these signs. If we have a protocol in place that helps, particularly with these things that can escalate very quickly, I think it would be helpful, as opposed to trusting everything to intuition. Again, what happens if a new grad is in there who hasn't developed the critical thinking to be able to make those moves and adjustments in time to help the patient?
And speaking of critical thinking, what physician on earth who is board certified and trained and works in an emergency room is going to tell a registered nurse to sit down and watch a stable patient? This is where I actually disagree with you, Alice. I don't think that was an order. And if that was an order, that physician needs to be fired. What physician in a busy emergency room is going to tell a nurse to sit and watch a stable patient who is not seizing? So you cannot, even if, let's say that was in California and the ratio was 1 to 4 and that hospital was real cute and actually able to keep their ratio. So she's just supposed to abandon her other 3 patients while she sits and watches a woman who is not actively having a seizure at that time. So whether that was an order or not, Tracy, I think you brought this pace up. We have to stand up for ourselves. And most ER nurses, because I was a bedside ER nurse and you can tell the attitude, most ER nurses will be like, Dr. Jones, you're crazy. You want me to sit here and watch this one patient who is stable, but meanwhile, I got 3 other patients and we just got a call on the radio. We got a trauma coming in. So you want me to sit here and watch a stable patient? Like,
what happens, Dr. Jones, to your point, what happens if I'm sitting out there in the waiting room watching this semi-stable patient and then something's happening with one of my other patients, and then that's the videotape we're going to see on TikTok next. And then that nurse is sitting there saying, well, I had an order to sit and watch a stable patient in the ED. At some point, it cannot be on the nurse.
On the nurse. Then it comes back to the nurse. Well, why didn't she say something to that doctor and just be like, she's stable, I'm not going to, just like what I said, right? So there's no way that this nurse honestly could win if she was doing her job the right way. And that's the part that we also don't know, right? Maybe she wasn't. Maybe she
Right.
was slacking off. Maybe she didn't tell anybody about this patient. Maybe she shooed the husband away because she didn't like his truck, but he was being a completely lovely person. Like, there's just so much we don't know there. And I think we are in this
Correct.
culture, and it's particularly misogynistic, if I do say so, that we are in this culture of blaming nurses. And when
Correct.
something goes wrong, the nurse is the highest touch point of the patient and probably the most knowledgeable in that intimate patient moment. So let's just go ahead and blame them without examining the larger picture and the bird's eye view, like you said, Alice.
Okay, so let me say this. Let's not blame any particular staff member, but let's just say we blame healthcare. Because what were to happen if that patient died in the emergency room? Now, here's what, and because we're talking about it, and obviously rightfully so, because we've worked in the ER, we've worked in trauma. Like, I think everyone on here has worked in those very high acuity areas. But let's just step back from the patient's perspective, because we are also patients too, right? I've actually had the early workings of an anaphylactic reaction, and I literally had to demand. I literally slammed my hand on the desk like, I'm having an anaphylactic reaction, because I too was asked to sit and wait in the emergency room. And I just got up and I spoke up, but I knew if I didn't, I would die. I ended up being intubated because my throat swelled up. True anaphylactic reaction to sulfa drugs. Okay. Just
Wow.
note. So if anybody ever take care of me, Nurse Alice is allergic to sulfa. But I just want to just turn it around for the public's perspective. If that patient had died, would we be telling a different story? Because right now obviously our system is broken. There's lots of areas and things that we need to fix. But what does that mean for the patient? I hate to say this, but it's like I go to a restaurant and I order a particular food and they're out of something. And I'm just like, that's not my problem. I ordered this because it's on the menu. Don't offer this if you can't provide this. So I know that maybe not the best example, but patients are coming for care. So all they know is that their loved one needs care or they need care. They don't necessarily particularly care that you're short staffed or you had 2 people call out sick or this or that happened. And while we would like some compassion, we can understand that the consumer may not care about, and it's quite as detailed about what goes on behind the scenes, because there's this front that you sell this. Well, I'm here to buy. I don't know, and I don't really care about what happens behind closed doors. I just want this. So if the patient would have died in that emergency room, would we be having a different conversation? And also, point 2 is, unfortunately, in a very litigious government, litigious, everybody's litigious now. The family is going to say, but did you not have a duty to care for this patient? Where were the duties? I know that we're strained. I know we're short-staffed. I know that people are arguing over here about Filipino mafia and I'm being bullied and all of these other things going on here. But the lawyer in that courtroom is going to explain to the judge that the healthcare system failed to provide adequate surveillance and intervention for my loved one who had a seizure, developed a hypoxic injury, and is now in a persistent vegetative state. I'm just saying, something to consider, right?
I think that's why, to answer your question, having protocols in place is very important. Learning from lessons like this, where you have these near misses, or you have these close calls, that you can have something that you learn from. This should be in some sort of in the hospital where this happened, that they're doing a root cause analysis. They're trying to determine where were our failures, where were our opportunities to improve. Because like my quality improvement guru Deming says all the time, about 85% of these things, when things go wrong in the hospital setting, it's usually the system. It's usually about a process that's not in place. It's not about the individual people that are involved. Because for the most part, you see how once they identified that there was an issue with this patient, they have been trained. They have been educated. They snapped to it immediately. They knew all the things to do. They got her out of the chair. They put her on the ground. I'm sure they rolled her to her side, did all of the things that you would do now that she's having a seizure. We could have that same level of training if we learn from this experience of saying, what do we do when a patient presents to our busy ED with a history? They are stable right now, but what protocols can we put in place that keeps them safe? And I think that is the important thing, to learn from these situations, not to throw up our hands and say, oh, well, the husband wasn't there. He should have been there watching. Not to blame it on the patient, and not to blame it either on the staff, who were very likely, I don't know all the situation, but very likely, because you see this happening so often, particularly in the ED setting, they were probably doing the best that they could. in
Right.
that model that exists in the ED of that treatment.
Yeah, I agree with that protocol
Yes.
idea that in the waiting rooms, I worked where the waiting room was really big. We were doing a lot of things in the waiting room, IVing people, taking blood draws. I once had a physician ask me to put a Foley in the waiting room. And I was like, but doctor, how? And I'm looking around in a crowded waiting room. And he's like, don't you guys have those old curtains? So this is where I had to go get my charge nurse to say like, okay, they want me to do a Foley in a waiting room. That's not dignified. So getting other measures up. But circling back to the protocol, what we did was we had a team that was in charge of the waiting room that would revitalize, taking people vital signs again after a few hours or after we gave a pill. So they weren't just in a chair and forgotten about, and a nurse would round on them. So in these other institutions and hospitals, this is probably what they need, a waiting room protocol for waiting room patients. Because there is no ratio by any association that lists what is the ratio of patients waiting in a pre-op or in a waiting room to how many nurses. That has not existed yet or been.
Absolutely. And so, well, unfortunately, when we see stories like this, it opens our eyes. Tragic, but at least nevertheless opens our eyes to opportunities for improvement, opening our eyes to understand that yes, our system is broken and this is where the cracks are and this is what we need to address. So hopefully that is something that will be part of the next steps, not just for that particular emergency room, but emergency rooms and hospitals across the nation. So guys, we've covered 3 stories, 3 different individuals, but with one shared thread of a healthcare system that was either too slow, too stretched, or too silent when it mattered the most. From Adriana's case, when medical decisions don't always lie in the hands of patients or families, to Camille's experience, which shows how quickly support can turn into stereotyping and how we must take care of what we must be careful when naming our pain instead of labeling it as a group, labeling it for what it may be, such as incivility. And then to this last painful story of Jamie and how patients with complex and what we'll call silent conditions can be dismissed even when they deteriorate in plain sight. So these aren't just outliers. These are symptoms of a deeper dysfunction of our healthcare system. So thank you so much for being here and joining us. We have told the truth. We have advocated, and we will advocate harder and go louder and do all of these things that we need to do. I hope today's conversation was a wake-up call to many. I hope it's provided some insight, opened your eyes, made you look at something a little bit differently, or at least consider it, because that was the goal for Nurse Talk Live tonight. And so again, I want to thank our guests for joining us. Dr. James Simmons, Tracy Holder, Alicia Truelove, and Dr. Dana Vidal. Thank you so much for joining us. And thank you for everyone tuning in for Nurse Talk Live. This was our first episode. And if I might say, these are also graduates of the MeteorX Academy, with the exception of Dr. James, who is a seasoned TV health expert. And I think y'all did an awesome job, just by the way. Kudos to you all. I'm sure this will go long and far. But I'd like to invite everyone watching, tune in next week as we have another episode of Nurse Talk Live. We will share on LinkedIn what our episode will be, and hopefully our guests for today will join us. But if not, we'd like to invite some other guests to join us as well for a flavorful conversation. So to everyone who's watching, continue to make good choices, be kind to one another, and live well, my friends. Talk to you soon.